All right. Freebird. Freebird. What's Freebird? What's up, buddy? Oh, it's like what? I'm gonna do a review today, Leighton and some other guys, but I wanted to start off with some guitar stuff. Just play some guitar for you guys for a little bit. Like another minute or so. All right, let me think. Little tune here. You hear that dissonance? Now to some theology stuff. Just got to set this down. Probably going to do that every time. All right. All right, guys. So it's been a minute. Hopefully, I'm not too loud. Let me see. Okay. All right. So it's been a minute, guys. It's been a minute since I've done a live or video. Been busy. Lots to talk about. Lots of good stuff. Good stuff. The Lord's been doing some good stuff. So been busy, but overall good. So I can move my camera. So today I wanted to play a video for you, and I kind of want to react to it, right? React to the video, talk about the video, and address some things about this video. Now, let me give you a little context. Yesterday, Trinity Radio, which is, Trinity Radio is ran by Braxton Hunter. You also have Jonathan Pritchett. So those two are kind of the well-known individuals within Trinity Radio. Obviously Leighton too. I would say Leighton's part of that group. Yeah, some other guys. Derek Bueller is kind of also in that group or getting into that group. He's been on a couple of their videos last couple of weeks. So I'm going to review this video they did yesterday on Romans 8, 26 through 30, I believe it is. But I'm only going to concentrate on the when they talk about the golden chain of redemption. When they made the thumbnail, right, that was the kind of the title. It was the golden chain of redemption. They were going to talk about Romans 8, 26 to 30. And they had Leighton, they had Derek, they had Jonathan Pritchett, as always. They had another guy named Nick, who also comes on. I think they do these videos every, what's today, Tuesday? I don't even know what day I'm on anymore. Yeah, so just it was Monday. Yeah, so every Monday they do these videos. Beeler. Derek Beeler. Okay, thank you. And so they every Monday they do these videos where they're going through a couple of verses, the book of Romans, and they're finally on chapter 8, right? Romans chapter 8. And so they're going to talk about predestination and election. And of course, they're going to bring Leighton on to talk about it as well, which I haven't seen him in the other videos. So I don't know if this was like intentional, maybe. Doesn't matter. But anyways, I'm going to play the part where, so the video I'm going to play, Nick and this other gentleman, I believe his name is JT, I think, they have already left the live stream. And so now it's just Derek, Leighton, and Jonathan. And so they're going to go through the golden chain of redemption. That's what, that's what it's called. That's what the Reformed theology has been known as, the golden chain of redemption. Those God foreknew, he predestined to conform to his son. He called, he justified, he glorified. And so I'm going to go through this video, play the video, and give some pushback. All right. I was in the comment sections last night in the live stream, and I was trying to give some pushback. I was trying to get a Calvinist onto the video. Because although the video wasn't about Calvinist or Calvinism, it had to deal with Romans 8:29, which has to deal with election and predestination. And although the video was not about Calvinist or Calvinism, they talked. It was a great portion of their conversation was about Calvinists and Calvinism, And so I want to give that pushback that I was hoping or another Calvinist, because there was another gentleman, another friend of mine who, was willing to go on to not so much defend or debate, but just give his input and his pushback on their interpretation of that verse. And so it didn't happen though, unfortunately, but now we're here. So let's just get right to it. I'll try not to make this long or stop too much, but I want to address a couple of things. And before we started, I'm missing one thing. Sorry, hold on one second. One second. All right, back. So I needed this big thing right here. This is one of my Bibles, and so I need this. So, all right. So let me get the video up here, and let's get to it. All right. So here we go.
Destination. We've kind of beat this to death here, this working together. Golden chain of overinterpretation. I love Nick Quint for making these PowerPoints. The golden chain of eisegesis.
So that's hilarious. Okay. I'm a Calvinist, and I think that's hilarious. Overinterpretation. That's very funny. I think we should be able to laugh at those things. So I find it funny. But anyways, let's keep going. One second. Here we go.
Golden chain of overinterpretation. I love Nick Quint for making these PowerPoints. The golden chain of eisegesis. The golden chain of you made that up.
I'll go on the record saying I think it's a great chain. It's a chain unbroken for those who have loved God in the past, because look at the chain. Look at the chain of all the things that God did for those who've loved him over the centuries. Yeah. Because that's what prognosko in my interpretation is referring to, those formerly known, those known before. And so this is the reason I think, and my argument is the reason he switches in verse 29 to past tense verbs is because he's talking about those in the past. And so how do you prove that God has brought about good for the suffering of his people than by looking at those in the past who have suffered?
Joel is going to scream at you, Dr. Flowers, about.
Okay. So they're going to get into the provisionist view, right? They're going to call it the Flowers view. And you kind of already got a glimpse of it. Basically, this is about all the Old Testament saints. This is what it's going to be about, right? That's why it's in the past tense. It's in the Old Testament. It's about the Old Testaments. But what they're going to discuss as well, which I think gives credence more to the Calvinistic view or Calvinistic interpretation, or I would say what Paul originally meant, is they're going to talk about how the Bible speaks of things in the past tense, not simply because they have already come to pass, but in a way, it speaks in such a way that a thing is already assured to come to pass. It's already going to, it's almost like it happened already, right? And a great example, and I don't want to get too much into it just yet because they're going to get to it, but there's a great example when God talks to Abraham. And I think it's 12 or 15. I could look it up, being a little lazy here, but I believe it's 12, 15, maybe 17. But anyways, he says this phrase. It's very interesting. He says, I have already made you a father of the nations. And so there it's past tense. I have already done this, right? But that was when God approached Abraham, right? When he came to Abraham and told him to leave the land of Ur, and go to the land that God was going to show him. Abraham just had received the call. So how could God tell Abraham, I have already made you a father of nations, right? As if like this already happened. And the same thing happens in the book of the prophets. Even though they're going to go into exile and then they are in exile, God speaks in such a way. He says, I have redeemed you, but they're still in exile. They haven't been redeemed yet. And so the Bible speaks in this manner in which a thing is already, it speaks in the past tense because it's so, God has so planned it, and has ordained it to come to pass that it's a sure thing. It will come to pass. Abraham, even though it was in the past tense, I have made you a father. God could say that because that was going to come to pass in the future. It was not going to fail to come to pass that Abraham would be a father of nations. Same thing with the Israelites in exile. God was going to redeem them. This was going to come to pass. And so God speaks as if it already happened. I have already redeemed you. I have already made you a father of nations. And that's very important to understand. And they're going to get into that. But just kind of wanted to give a little taste of what's coming. But let's keep going.
Okay.
It's technically aorist that we render in English in the simple past tense. But okay.
Yeah, well, I'm
Does anyone wanna
standing on the shoulders of other exegetes that make
I
this
hear
argument.
me too. That's every Christian is standing on the shoulders of other Christians. But this predestically justi glorified. Nick, well done. I like it. You should have added
Well,
4, but I
just
know that we're
something-
already discussing.
Just something to notice too. In verse 20, it begins with, "For those he foreknew, he also predestined," which already tells us that predestination is not equivalent to foreknowledge. So we can all go home now.
Well, there are those who will say that foreknew here.
Okay, did you guys hear Nick? Right? Nick was the one speaking. He said, foreknowledge, predestination are the same. I completely agree. And I think every Calvinist should. Every Calvinist I read, systematic theology books that I've read, they do draw this distinction because there is a distinction. Even though election and predestination are hand in hand, very close, they go together. There is a difference between the foreknowledge or the election and the predestination. Now, listen to what Jonathan's going to say here. I find this interesting.
Is really better rendered as foreordination.
And they
And how is that different than predestination?
So
I don't know. I'm just telling you that there are Calvinists who do that.
So
Not all
for those God foreordains, i.e., predestines, he predestines.
Right.
So he's just redundantly repeating the same meaning.
Yeah, that's why
twice.
I wanted to say no.
Okay, so Jonathan was saying that there's some people who who say that this word foreknew here in Romans 8:29 is foreordained, right? And so Leighton, of course, says, "Oh, foreordained, predestined are the same," so that's kind of redundant. Well, I think a better way to look at it is how Ephesians 1 lays it out, right? Ephesians 1 says he chose us in him, and then it says he predestined us. Again, they're not the same thing, right? The election, the choosing in Ephesians, and here the foreknowing. Another way I like to say it is he appointed, he chose, right? He appointed or he chose those he foreknew. And then predestination has to do, okay, what did he choose them for? What did he appoint them for? Predestination really has to do with the outcome, right? These individuals that he has chosen, that he has appointed, that he foreknew, they're going to be holy and blameless. They're going to be conformed to the image of his son. So there's the choosing, and then there's the outcome of that choosing. I've chosen Paul and those at Ephesus, and I've chosen them in my son, and I predestined them to be holy and blameless. And so there is a distinction here between the choosing, the appointment, and the predestination. And we see this in scripture, in Jeremiah, when God talks to Jeremiah. And I'm going to bring this passage back just in the future in a little bit here. But there's this Hebrew parallelism that Jeremiah uses when he says, when God tells Jeremiah, before you were formed, I knew you. Okay. Excuse me. Okay. That's not mere knowledge, not knowledge about Jeremiah. But listen to the next phrase. Before you were born in the womb, I knew you. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I appointed you. So knew and appointed. Okay. Same kind of concept here, right? God appointed Jeremiah for a specific, he chose him for a specific purpose. So you can say God foreknew Jeremiah. He appointed Jeremiah for what? For to be a prophet to Israel. Okay, so you have the election, you have the choosing of Jeremiah, and then you have the predestination. For what did he choose him for? To be a prophet to Israel. And so they go hand in hand, but there is a distinction. Those that he appointed, he also predestined them to a certain outcome. So I think that's a fair distinction. I think the Bible speaks of it. Ephesians, we got Jeremiah. We also have First Peter, several other places in the Bible where it does draw this distinction. And that's very important and key. So let's keep playing the video.
Not all Calvinists do that.
See, that just makes Paul a bad writer.
Yeah.
Now, foreknew, people will talk about this gnosko being an intimate, not merely prescient knowledge or propositional knowledge, but an intimate knowledge. those whom he foreknew here is more than just knowing something about a person, but actually knowing them in a more intimate, personal way. Intimate, personal. Not from Arkansas. Give me a break. Intimate, personal. We don't get intimate with people. Intimate, personal way. This is deeper than just, facts about somebody. So when the Arminian says, well, God knew facts about people.
Yes. Jonathan is right there. That foreknew is not just simply knowledge, because God knows everybody, right? If we're just talking about in knowledge, God having knowledge of people, he knows everybody. So this would make no sense if this is just about knowledge, but it's about covenant, right? Really, it's what it's about. So it's like this covenant language. When in Amos, I believe it's Amos 3, and even in Romans 11, which they're going to bring up in a little bit here, but let me go to Amos really quickly here. Amos, I believe it's 3. He says, hold on, I have it here highlighted somewhere. I think it's 3. Okay, yeah, so 3 verse 2, he says, he's talking to Israel, obviously. He says, you only have I known of all the families of the earth. Therefore, I will punish you for all your iniquities. So known there is not just knowledge, because God knew about the Babylonians, the Assyrians. He knew about the Canaanites, right? So it's not just mere knowledge, but it's a covenantal language. Those that he intimately knew, those that he entered into covenant with, those he predestined, right? The ones he entered into covenant with, the ones he appointed, he predestined, right? And so, yes, foreknew is not, also the word foreknew is used about Jesus, right? In I believe it's First Peter. I want to pull it up here, and I'm going to address this. Hey, servant of Christ, how are you? Evening, brother. I want to address this a little bit later, but Peter also uses the word foreknowledge. According to the one second. He talks about Jesus being foreknown. And there again, it's not about simple knowledge, not that just God knew about Jesus, right? But rather that he appointed him, right? That he kind of in Reformed theology speak of the covenant of redemption. And so he appointed Christ to be the Lamb, the Savior, the mediator, etc. Same concept here in Romans 8:29, right? Those God intimately knew or covenantally knew, or he entered into covenant with, those he predestined. And so, yeah, that is very important. Foreknew is not just simple mere knowledge. All right, let's keep going.
Who would accept him, through faith, that's who he predestined. Or, yes, Adrian Rogers said this. God looked down the corridors of time. Yes, Adrian Rogers did say that in a sermon. You can find it.
No, he was wrong.
Yeah, he was wrong.
Okay, did you guys hear that? I don't know how many times people said that Calvinists misrepresent or whatever. Now, because one person, Adrian Rogers, said that, doesn't mean that they all believe that, right? But I think it's important to point out, Jonathan Pritchett here makes it clear that, yeah, there has been an Arminian that has said that. So I found that interesting. Let's keep going.
So when Arminians say no Arminian says this, well, Adrian Rogers did say that, but
Adrian Rogers probably wouldn't be considered an Arminian. So
true, he's a Southern Baptist.
Well, if I were to steelman some Arminians, because that is a very common Calvinist objection to the foreknowledge being like the knowing the future beforehand, is they'll say God foresees people, not actions. Like it's who does he foreknow, not what does he foreknow about these people. But if I were to steelman some Arminians, Leroy Forlines, to paraphrase him, it's God foreknows those who would believe, and that's where the chain goes from there. It's not foreknew that they would have faith, but he foreknew them as believers. So,
well, even I'll tell you what. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Oh, I was just simply going to say, what helped me, I think this was like last month actually, is the Potter's Promise. So hashtag Mr. LF for that. And what's your video? Romans 11:2. Did God cast away those people who we foreknew? That just listening to that and reading that, I literally scrambled through your book and finding that helped, because reading through N.T. Wright's commentary, like Wright mentions, I think from chapter 2, and then working his way up. Chapter 9, I think chapter 2, he mentions there is a Jew and a Jew, and then chapter 9, there is an Israel and an Israel. So right the way through, he's carrying this whole point of Jews, Israel and the Gentiles and so on and so forth. And then when I read your commentary, that kind of hit the nail on my head for me with this passage. Reading Romans 11:2, has God cast away his people whom he foreknew? And I think even in later on in chapter 11, where he mentions, the gifts and callings of God around repentance regarding the Israel that's been broken up. So it just made sense reading that into this in regards to the foreknowing would be the Israel or God's people who we foreknew back then in the past. And I think you kind of passed that out as you kind of read prior and then reading back to this passage.
That's where.
Okay, so a couple of things at the end. He said he goes to Romans 11 and then he reads that back into Romans 8. I find that interesting. But anyways, basically what this gentleman FTT said is that in Romans 11, Paul uses the word foreknew of Israel. So he says that to him, this was a light bulb moment that Romans 8:29, when it says God foreknew those he foreknew, can only means the Old Testament saints, right? Israel in the Old Testament. That's all. That's what it means, because Paul used the same word in Romans 11. But again, Amos 3 says that about Israel. Foreknown, Jesus is foreknown. Jeremiah is foreknown. Okay, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's just about the Old Testament saints. And furthermore, and we're going to get into this in just a little bit, but furthermore, how does this help those who are in Rome? If this foreknowledge and predestination and calling, justification, and glorification is only for those of the Old Testament, why bring that up to those in Rome if it does not apply to them? Now Leighton knows this is a question that people are going to ask, so he is going to address this. And when we get to that point, I will give some pushback. But okay, so even if you want to, like I said, even if you want to go back and just say, oh, it's just the Old Testament saints, okay, which ones? All of them? All the Old Testament saints? Only the ones that believe, the ones that didn't believe? I'm sure they're going to say, oh, no, these are the ones that believe. So then we get into the question of, well, did he foreknow them? When did he foreknow them? When they believed? Is that when they were foreknown? And that's something that's never going to get asked or never going to get answered. But anyways, let's keep going.
That's where Dr. Flowers and I land, which is why, as much as I like Forloin's explanation, and that would probably be my second most plausible interpretation.
I agree.
The first most plausible is what Junior just hit on, and I think that was the question behind Edwin P. Whipple's. Right. Who are those? And for those, and who are those? And that's why I don't have a problem going along with our Calvinist friends that, I'm all on board with this intimate knowing.
Right.
Great.
Yeah, that works great for our
That's good to hear.
Yeah, because
that's good to hear.
Those that God
Moses was intimately known. Isaiah was intimately known. Yeah. They were called according to the purpose. Look at how God worked out the sufferings they went through for his good and his purpose.
When were they foreknown? Was Moses foreknown in Exodus 3 when God called him? I would love for someone to answer that question. That's one of the questions I had last night that I don't know, for whatever reason it wasn't, they didn't put it up on the video. But when was Moses foreknown and predestined? Was it Exodus 3? Excuse me. Was it when he believed? When he went to Egypt? Could Moses not have been foreknown? Was it based on whether he would be obedient or not? Whether he would meet the condition or not? When was he foreknown? It surely can't be Exodus 3, because that's when he was called. Right? And the chain goes, those he foreknew, he predestined, he called. So it can't be Exodus 3, but that's when we first meet the encounter of God and Moses. So I would love for someone to give an answer to that question. That would be great. But let's keep going.
Purpose. What an awesome way to refer back to those formerly known and look at their sufferings and look at how God redeemed their sufferings for his good. He brought about the redemption of humanity through those very people's sufferings. And what better case could Paul be making than to reflect back on those formerly known?
Okay, this is another thing that throughout this video, they're going to keep on talking about the sufferings, right? That the reason Paul writes this chain here of these Old Testament saints is so that those in Rome can have comforts through their suffering, right? Because that's the context that Paul's talking about. He's talking about the suffering, right? And that we're waiting for the eternal hope and glory. So it's just about suffering. But that chain is what God does for his people. And first of all, suffering is not even in that verse. Okay. The reason that all things work for good is not simply because we have Old Testament saints as an example that they worked for good, but because God's plan of redemption. That's what this is about. It's the plan of redemption, right? Those he foreknew, he predestined, he called, he justified, he glorified. That's redemption. So they're going to keep talking about, oh yeah, we look at the Old Testament saints and how God saved them from suffering, which again goes back to, okay, so are those in Rome foreknown and predestined and called? And if so, when? When they believed? Were they foreknown once they accepted the invitation, once they met the condition? I would love to know that. Let's keep going.
Exactly, because this is a point I've made. What comes before verse 29 is 28, where he talks about, whichever A or B translation you take, and then verse 29 for those whom he foreknew. So it's continuing the thought. How do we know that God works these things out?
Right.
And it makes the most sense contextually. We have examples to look back at.
Right.
And it removes, if you think about it, it removes
not only examples. We don't just have examples to look back at. We have God's plan of redemption, right? It's not just simply, hey, look back at the Old Testament saints and you see them? Yeah, that's what he's going to do for you in your sufferings. Wait, but God knew them and predestined them and called them and justified them and glorified them. So is that something that he did for these in Rome and for any future person, for those in Ephesus and those at Colossae? Did he do that for them too? Or just the Old Testament saints? And is it just about suffering? Is that all that it's about in this chain here? This is just an example. Oh, look how Jeremiah suffered, but he made it through. Why did he make it through? Is it because he was foreknown? He was predestined to an end? He was called? He was justified? He was glorified or will be? Right? It's what's frustrating is that they're doing a lot of talking around the actual text. Right? They're trying to get away from what the Calvinistic interpretation is. And so they're doing a lot of talking around and around and around. And so, oh, suffering. We're just looking for suffering, just as examples of suffering. But is that what 29 says? It's about suffering. Why do all things work for good? Because God had a plan of redemption. And that plan does not fail. Right? That plan, those he foreknew, he predestined, he called, he justified, he glorified. That is going to come to pass. It will not fail to come to pass. And that's what Paul is getting at. That's why if they go to the next verse, verse 30, Paul says, what shall we say about these things? What things? Everything that was just said, especially the last verse. If God is for us, who can be against us? Right? This is not simply application to the Old Testament saints, but this is for those at Rome, those at Ephesus, and those that will believe. Right? And that's very important. But all they're going to do is talk about, look, examples for suffering, and they're just going to keep going around with that theme.
All the esoteric baggage of this, looking through the corridors of time thing, or this determination of every thought molecule and action, and all the different weird, debates that people have created since the 16th century. It just removes all of that, and it makes it so simple.
No, it doesn't remove it. Make it simple, right? Because they're not addressing the temporal aspect of it. They're just saying, oh, this is about the Old Testament saints. They were foreknown. God knew them. God predestined them. God called them. But when? Does it all happen at once? Are they foreknown once they believe? Are they called and foreknown at the same time? When are they foreknown? When are they predestined? When are they called? Does it happen again? Right? They say it's simple because they just want to say, oh, this is all about Old Testament saints. It's all about Testament saints. They were foreknown. They're predestined. When? Oh, I don't know. I don't know when it happened, but it just did. Right? That, and they say, oh, this is simple. This is simple. But there is a chain, and it's a temporal chain, right? When they're foreknown and when they're called is not the exact same timing. They're not called and then foreknown, right? They're not foreknown and called at the same time. They're not justified and foreknown, right? There is there's a chain and there's a time here. They're foreknown at one point, then they're predestined at one point, then they're called at one point, then they're justified at one point, then they're glorified at one point, right? It's something they never address in this whole time. They never address, okay, but what is this temporal aspect? What is this timing thing? When does these things happen for a person? When does God foreknow them? When does he predestine them? When does he call them? Right? And I'm not saying we have to know the exact time and date, but we do have to see the time frame, right? That when a person is called, it's not the same time frame of when they're justified or when they're foreknown or when they're predestined, right? And if you listen closely as we go through this video, it's almost like they switch it around, right? They're not foreknown until they believe, and they're not called until they believed. And they're not justified until they believe. And they're not glorified until they believe. And so it's like, wait, what? And hopefully you'll pick that up as we go through the video, but let's keep going.
Really does. And especially the fact that Paul uses the exact same term, like he said in chapter 11, verse 2, in reference to the formerly known Israelites of old.
Exactly. We know now. I like how Ben Witherington translates it in his commentary. He says, or he puts, we know, or we ought to know.
Hey, Reform
how
Doc,
do we
how are you, brother?
Well, we ought to know based on what God has done in the past, which is something that Paul has been talking about at least since chapter 4.
So is God foreknowing now? Is he predestining now? Is he calling now? Is he justifying now, or just in the past? Right? Is he doing these things now? Did he do it for those at Rome? Did he foreknow them? Did he predestine them? Did he call them? Was it before they believed, before they were born? Was it after they believed? Did they get the foreknown, the predestination, and the calling once they believe? Did all three of those things happen once they became believers?
He goes all the way back to creation in chapter 1, talking about the decline of civilization, as Nick likes to point out. But chapter 4, you have Abraham. You have David. I mean, how do we know? Well, look what God has done in the past.
Mm-hmm.
So those he foreknew, he what? He also predestined them.
Well, and this is where I think that the Calvinist interpretations have always kind of been lacking. Like Sean Wright in his book, speaking of the golden chain, says, Paul says the bedrock of Christian assurance goes all the way back to eternity, where God chose to place his love on his people. That's the meaning of foreknowledge in his view. But I think what that gives you is basically you got Romans 8:28, and then Paul leads into verse 29 being like, we know this because of this new revelation that I'm going to give to you to let you know how the Ordo Salutis works. And that doesn't flow at all to me.
No.
Okay, that new revelation, has Derek read Deuteronomy 7? I chose you not because you were good or strong or the biggest enemy, but because I set my love on you. I chose you because I set my love on you. Ephesians 1, in love, he predestined us. Like, this is not new revelation. Amos 3, right? Only you have I known. He entered into covenant with them, right? Look at Jeremiah, right? This is not new. If you understand what foreknew means, what knowing someone in the Hebrew, right? It's not just, again, intellect, right? But it's intimacy, it's covenantal, right? This is not new information. Now, Paul, maybe it's new in the sense of Paul is laying out, look, this is the plan of redemption. This is what God does. He covenantal language here, foreknew. He foreknew certain individuals, and he didn't foreknow them when they believed. No, he foreknew them before they were born. Jeremiah 1, before you were born, before I created you in the womb, I knew you, right? Before they were born, I knew you. Then I appointed you as a prophet. Same concept here. It's not new. Those he foreknew, those he entered into a covenant with, those that he chose and appointed, he predestined those to conform to the image of his son. That's not just for the Old Testament saints. That's for every believer, right? They're predestined to conform. He called them, he justified them, he glorified them. This is the plan of redemption. For Derek to say something like this was it was very interesting and funny. But this is not really new revelation, right? Again, maybe new in the sense that this is Paul's laying out here a chain of how God planned redemption from beginning, from knowing these individuals, from appointing these individuals to glorification of these individuals, right? The whole spectrum here, the whole spectrum is in this verse. Okay, maybe that aspect, but the fact that God would love a people and choose them because he loves them, not because they've met a condition, not because they're finally believers or because they're good enough or whatever the case may be, not because of any of those things, but because he loved them. That's why he chose them. That's Israel. That's Israel. He chose them because he loved them. And so I found that funny, but hey, it is what it is.
That doesn't work.
And more importantly, Ephesians, you might, and I seriously say no, you might be able to get there, assuming that pro katabalis cosmou means something about eternity, which is another conversation of getting into time and before time or logically prior to time or whatever. Whatever you think before the foundation of the world means, which I'm not certain we have a definitive answer to that.
Okay, I thought that was funny. We have no definitive answer to whatever before the foundation of the world means. Jesus was the lamb that was slain before the foundation of the world. I guess I don't know what that means. I found that to be funny. I don't get what the point of that was. Like it. I mean, for people who say, "Oh, it's so simple," whatever the plain meaning is, whatever the most simple meaning is, all of a sudden, before the foundation of the world becomes this very difficult thing to understand. I don't get it. But let's keep going.
Paul knows how to write the phrase. It's not in Romans 8 and Ephesians 1. However you take that, which we can haggle over, did he choose individuals to be in Christ, which is not what it says. However,
that's true. Servant of Christ. We don't, even if we don't know what it means, it's clearly what it can't mean. That's true too. Yeah.
You want to hash out Ephesians 1, Paul knows how to say something like that may give you help there. It's not here in Romans 8:29. There's nothing about logically prior to the temporal cosmos.
Right.
Eternity past here.
Well,
okay. So when did he foreknow them? Can't be the same time that he called them. Can't be the same time that he justified them. Right? There are aspects here. There's some type of temporal time aspect. And I would say even before the foundation of the world. So not just temporal, right? Not just on this kind of playing field, right? On this world, but even before then. Again, Jeremiah, before you were born, I knew you. I appointed you before you were born. So is it really far stretched to think that here for those he foreknew means those he loved, those he appointed, those he entered into covenant with? Is that really far stretched when we have biblical passages in the Old Testament that speak this way? What about Isaac? Right? Before he was born, he was chosen and appointed. So I don't think it's a stretch at all. I don't think it's a stretch at all, to be honest with you. I think it's clear if you look at the Old Testament, and Paul is using the Old Testament. That's what he has at that time as his scripture. It's not a far stretch at all to say foreknowledge is those that he knew before there was time. He predestined them. And then at some point, when time came to be, he called them. And then he justified them. And eventually glorified them, right? So they never answer when did he foreknow them. They just know, oh, these are Old Testament saints. Okay.
And so I've held to this, which you and Leighton and we're all talking about. I've held to this view for quite a while, but before I I think this is the Ben Witherington interpretation. I flirted with that for a little bit. I think it's where, like, because verse 28 says all things work together, that when you go into verse 29, you're kind of like looking at the end backwards and saying, like, we were able to see this, right?
Yeah. For clarity, jumping back to verse 18, for
That's
the
where I was
sufferings
going.
of the present time are not worthy to be compared to the glory that is to be revealed in the future. And this Romans 8:20, 9 and 30 is a looking back from the perspective of that future. That's been Witherington's interpretation.
Right. And
I give him number 3. His reading is number 3rd most likely. I give the Old Testament saints the most likely. I give the traditional Arminian God foreknew the people who would believe the forloins thing. I give that number 2. I give Witherington's number 3, which is kind of building on forloins view, but adds this from the future looking back perspective. The reason why I don't buy that,
That's more of a corporate view as well, if I'm not mistaken. That's kind of a corporate perspective as well, the Witherington view.
but the reason why I don't find Witherington as even convincing as the standard forloins Arminian perspective is he's assuming something about glorified that I don't assume.
Right.
He's assuming that, like a lot of exegetes get this wrong, that glorified is something about the body in the new heavens and new earth, looking back from that. Whereas there's nothing about being glorified here that has to do with the bodies. Romans 8 does talk about the redemption of our bodies, but it doesn't say anything about the glorification of our bodies. This is talking about foreknowing people, predestining those people, calling those people, justifying those people, and glorifying their bodies? No, glorifying them. Honorific language. He is highly esteeming, highly honoring them. He's glorying them.
well, and
Them, not their bodies, them.
it goes with Colossians 3:4, where he says, when Christ returns, you too will be revealed in glory with him. And it doesn't say that, like revealed in glory, right? So it kind of implies that there's a condition that is being given, and then it's revealed in the end times, but Christ is also revealed at that same time. So it doesn't have to be something that is like what you're saying, like the redemption of the body.
Right. Go back to
Well, and if it is in reference to the redemption of the body, then it even supports the reading that we hold to even more so, because people like Isaiah and Moses and all the saints of the past have been glorified in that sense that they have their bodies have passed on and they are present. You could argue they are currently present with the Father.
Well, but they don't have their glorified. They don't have their imperishable.
Well, that could be an argument. That could be an argument.
Yeah, so I find this funny here. Jonathan gives some pushback, and I think it's fair pushback. So far with everything here, I can agree with. I mean, there's nothing really here, but they're about to get back to the whole predestination election thing. So give it a second.
Argument.
For 1 Corinthians 15, they're imperishable bodies. They don't have those, the heavenly bodies. But this is talking about, in verse 21, that the creation itself will also be set free from its slavery to corruption into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. The glory of the children, the high honor, the high glory. That doxa, that's honorific language in the ancient Mediterranean world that has a meaning. Now, you skip to verse 23. He does talk about adoption as the redemption of our bodies, but that's a part of the glory, but that's not the glory that Paul's hammering on about here. He's talking, this is honor language. He's talking about the glorification of these people. And so I don't see how you get the Ben Witherington view from this, which should tell you that if we think, we'll call it the Dr. Flowers view. This is about, we ought to know because God has already done this with Old Testament saints like Abraham and David. We'll call it the Flowers view. And then you have
What did he do with the Old Testament saints that he's not doing with the New Testament saints? Well, their focus is on the suffering here, right? We know all things work out for good because look at the example. So my question is: so are people people now not foreknown? Does God not foreknow people now? Only in the past? Does he know them in the past? So did he foreknow me when I became a believer 3-4 years ago? Is that when he foreknew me? Is that when he predestined me? I find this. I'm sorry. Yeah, it's interesting. But let's keep going. It gets even better. Pritchett kind of sounds like Jesse or Bart. I've listened to Bart a little bit. I can see that.
The Forloins view, which is the standard Arminian view. Then you have the modified Arminian view of Witherington. We put that at number 3, most likely. I would put that this is a passage about a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, talking about Han Solo and Chewbacca as more likely than the Calvinist reading that those who God foreordained, he predestined prior to the creation.
Okay, you see how Jonathan presented the Calvinist view? Chewbacca, San Holo, universe somewhere else. Oh, I found that funny. But again, it's actually not. It's actually not unreasonable. It's actually what Paul's saying, right? Could you imagine, right? Looking back at the Old Testament, looking at this word foreknew and how God uses it of people, and God never says, "I foreknew you." Once you accepted my proposition or my condition, right? That's when I foreknew you. That's when I predestined you. It's never like that. Foreknowing someone is always before. Foreknowing is appointing them, right? How can he appoint them or enter into covenant if they have to believe to be foreknown, if they have to be believers, right? That's why he says, look, Moses was foreknown. Isaiah was foreknown. Yet when were they foreknown? When they were called? I don't think we'll ever get an answer to that question, but this is funny.
Of a temporal cosmos. That is like the least likely interpretation of all of this. And you can see that we have at least one that I made up. We have the Calvinist interpretation.
By the way, I would be willing to have Jonathan, Pritchett, and Leighton. I would love to talk to both of them about this passage if they'd be willing to come on, if they'd be willing to do it, to have a Calvinist talk about this passage. And I mean, if the Calvinist interpretation is that crazy, it should be no problem. It should be no problem having Calvinists on to talk about it and having them, lay out the reasons why this is so unreasonable and not even close to being right, the Calvinist view. So, I mean, it's up there. If they want to do it, I would love to do it.
And we have 3 non-Calvinist interpretations that we can debate without even considering Calvinism, and that's important to note.
No, go ahead.
It's important to note, no Calvinism, guys. No Calvinism.
Oh, go ahead, Junior.
I was just going to say, and this even goes back to what you mentioned as well. Look how Paul uses creation as that example of the believers, right? So verse 18, for I consider that the sufferings present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory. And then he uses creation as the example. Creation also, so he says, verse 20, for the creation was subject to bondage, right? Not willingly, but that he calls it subject to the same, that the creation itself will be set free. And then he mentions in verse 22, for we know that the whole creation. So again, it's in reference to something that we can look back and see, this is an example of. So creation is that example. It's been, this has happened to it, and then so on and so forth. So, and then that word again, I think you mentioned, for we know that the whole creation is groaning and waiting. So he's using that as an example for verse 18. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time is not worthy to be compared with the glory. Using creation as that example for something that we know, and then he goes down, obviously the passage at hand. Where is it? And we know, and we know that all things work together for good, and so on and so forth. So again, it's this looking backwards because we have this example, right? So the looking backwards would be, well, what is the example? If Paul is using creation as an example, looking backwards, and then he's going to verse 28 saying, for we know. So what is the example going backwards? It's people. Who is the people in the example?
I would agree with you, Junior, but I think that you're actually making a very good argument for Witherington's view, because verse 18 follows verse 17 about, if children, heirs of God, and fellow or co-heirs with Christ, indeed, if we suffer for him, that we may also be glorified with him. That is kind of future looking, though. So the present sufferings, the glory that is to be revealed, could also be future looking. So I think that actually gives what you just said gives credence to the Witherington view more so than it does the Flowers view.
Well, and for those.
Okay, so he just this junior guy just said, "Hey, we can look back and see. Look, the world was cursed, and so we're looking back in the past to something that happened." And so he's saying that in verse 29, same thing, right? That Paul's saying, like, we can look back to examples of people who were suffering and look how they came out. But the verse says that he foreknew, not that we foreknew, right? So is God looking back to the Old Testament saints? Or are we supposed to look back to the Old Testament saints because God foreknew them, and that somehow, like, it just, honestly, for me, it confused whatever he just said. But somehow he tried to get it to basically say, hey, we look back. And so Paul is saying, hey, look back to those God foreknew. When did he foreknow them? I don't know. Maybe the same time he called them, but and honestly, guys, it's not that difficult. But because there is this, I would say, an agenda to get around what Paul is saying, right? To get around and try to destroy. I don't want to say destroy, but to basically let people know, hey, this interpretation is false. There's a lot better ones. Don't go that way, right? In order to do that, they have to go around the passage, make it about examples, make it about suffering. At least this portion. Again, the context does talk about suffering. I'm not doubting that. And you know what? We could say, yeah, we could look back. I don't even deny that. We could definitely look back at the examples. But is that why Paul made this chain of redemption so that we can simply look back? And so what are we looking back to? If God foreknew them, predestined them, then did he foreknow us and predestine us and call us just like he did the Old Testament saints? I don't think Leighton or any of the panel here would agree that God foreknew us, predestined us, and called us. Because again, it's just about the Old Testament saints. So anyways, let's keep going.
I was reading some of the, sorry, for those in the comments that were kind of confused about what we're arguing for, the view we're arguing for, I will admit that if you've not thought through these things before, if you've not heard our view, it can kind of sound like it's out there, like, oh, I've always thought of this as a, foresight view or a predetermination kind of concept, and it may be hard to follow. And so this quote from my commentary from Tim Warner may help, because he kind of gives you an overview of this passage from his perspective. Let me read it. It says, Paul was not referring to some prior knowledge in the mind of God before creation, nor was he speaking about predetermining their fate. He was referring to those whom God knew personally and intimately, men like Abraham and David, for example. The term foreknew.
Okay. Hold on. I want to listen to this really quick. Listen to this really quick.
With Christ, indeed, if we suffer for him, that we may also be glorified with him. That is kind of future looking, though. So the present with Christ in
prior knowledge in the mind of God before creation, nor was he speaking about predetermining their fate.
Okay. This is not about, Paul was not talking about God's knowledge of the person or predetermining their fate, is what this commentator is saying. But he predestined them to conform to the image of the Son. So are they going to conform or not? Is he predestining them to a certain outcome or not? I'm not saying that's fate. I don't believe in fate, but isn't that what predestination is? That they're going to become something, going to an end, a specific end. So I find that interesting. But also, who says that Paul's not talking about, this is about those God knew beforehand, right? Or in God's mind, right? Why not? When God says to Jeremiah, before you were born, I knew you. Is that not referring to God's plan, God's choosing and appointing, knowing him beforehand? So why in here, in this verse, does it not mean that same thing? Why? And again, going back to David and Abraham, when did he foreknow them? Is he foreknowing them in time? Right? That's something an open theist would say. right? He's knowing them in time, right? And so when is he foreknowing these individuals? That's what I would love to know. When did he foreknow David? When he called him? When David believed? When David was justified? Well, never, I don't know. We'll get an answer.
He was referring to those whom God knew personally and intimately, men like Abraham and David, for example. The term foreknew does not mean to have knowledge of someone before they were conceived. The verb simply is the word for know, and it's an intimate sense, which a presupposition before prefix.
I don't know what happened with Leighton there,
is
but
having an intimate relationship with someone in the past. Literally, we could render Romans 8:29 as follows: for those God formerly knew, I need my glasses on here. For those God formerly knew, he previously determined them to conform them into the image of his son. The individual saints of.
When did God enter into an intimate relationship with Jeremiah? When did he enter into a covenant relationship with him? According to Jeremiah 1. That's something I wish they would answer.
Of old, with whom God had personal relationship, were predestined by him to be conformed in the image of Christ. That is, God predetermined to bring their salvation to completion by the sacrifice of Christ on their behalf. And again, and I cite some other scholars who hold to the same view, but I just want to make sure people are following the kind of the course of Paul's thought through this process. The reason I think he begins to shift to the past tense, even though I do recognize that you can talk about somebody glorified in the Greek language as if it's an already not yet kind of concept. It's a very rare usage, however. And therefore, I think the more simple concept is to say that the reason he shifts to the past tense is because he's talking about those intimately known in the past.
And
no, the Bible does speak of things as if they already happened, right? Abraham, I have made you a father of nations. Those are Israelites. I have redeemed you, right? When he talks to Abraham about saving Israel from Egypt, right? They're going to go into slavery, and I will judge them, and I will bring them out, right? Okay, so that's future tense, but he tells Abraham about this event as if it already happened. They're going to be judged. They're going to be delivered. This is common biblical language because the Bible speaks not just from our perspective, not just from what we see, but from God's perspective, right? Of things not only that he already knows, simply knows, but that he's already appointed and chosen to accomplish, right? His decree. I know that word gets scary for a lot of provisionists, but his decree, right? His eternal plan and will, right? These things God speaks as if they already happened. So no, it's not that. Well, we shouldn't look at the aorist. Talking about the Greek here, because they have a gentleman who was on the live, who was in the comment section talking about Greek. But God does speak in this manner. So God can say, those he foreknew, he predestined, he called, he justified, he glorified, as if it already happened. Why? Because it's his plan. It's what he had purposed for his people, his elect, those whom he appointed, those whom he loved. I mean, it really is that simple. It really is that simple. And only an individual or individuals who do not like that concept have to make this very difficult or very vague. Very vague. When did he know the Old Testament saints? When did he predestine them? When did he call them? When did these things happen? They're not all happening at once. But let's keep going.
And to put a button on what Junior was saying, what he was saying sounded like you could put it more towards the Witherington column, except for the fact that this passage shifts.
Right.
In 23 and 24, and maybe you were thinking this, where it talks about what's going on with us, and this is a passage about insurance, about our hope, and what do we bank that hope on while we're groaning, the Spirit's groaning, creation's groaning, we're suffering, all of this. What do we base that hope on? That hope would be on the people of the past, that we could, because of what God has done in the past. So that I think I think 22 through 24 swings it away from the Witherington thing to the Flowers thing.
It also makes a lot of sense just if you're using the whole counsel of God, because you can go read it in Psalm 77, but throughout the Old Testament all the time when they need hope for deliverance, what do? They look backwards, and in Psalm 77 particularly, and a lot of other places, they look back to the Exodus. God was faithful here, so we know he will be faithful in the future. So Paul is just kind of, in my opinion, doing the same thing. We have hope for the future because we look back at what God has previously done.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. They did look back a lot, right? In times of trouble. No problem there. But like Derek said, let's look at the whole counsel of God. Jeremiah 1. Before you were born, I knew you. I appointed you. Right? That's in the counsel of God. The word knew is in that passage. It's not simply just looking back, right? Remember, this is about God. This is what God is. So God is sorry guys, this is a mess. It really is a mess. In my opinion, it's a mess. The whole counsel of God. It's not simply, Paul's not simply telling us, hey, look back. You see what he foreknew them, he predestined them, he called them, he justified them, glorified them. Well, you know what? We can look to them and say, hey, we can suffer with joy because he did it for them. What? It's really difficult. It's really difficult here. But again, the reason that all things work for our good, the reason we can rejoice in our suffering is because of God's plan that will not fail. That those that he foreknew, not just the Old Testament saints, he didn't just know the Old Testament saints. Okay. Paul's a New Testament saint. He says in Galatians, before I was born, I was appointed as an apostle to preach the gospel of God before he was born. He's not a New Testament saint. So when was he foreknown? When was he predestined? When was he called? He wasn't called at the same time he was foreknown. But Paul says, I was appointed, I was chosen before I was born in my mother's womb, Paul says. And he's not an Old Testament saint. God foreknew Paul. He predestined Paul to conform to his son. He called Paul. He justified Paul and glorified Paul. It's really that simple. Really that simple. But like I said, you got to make it very difficult when you got to get around the simplicity of this text, the simplicity of election and predestination. When you have to get around it, you got to do all this talk, all this going around, making it about suffering, making it about look at example of people, which again, fine, definitely let's look back. Let's look at what he did through his servants and in the exile and how he kept them. No problem there. But this passage here, Paul did not write this simply so we can look back at those God predestined and called. I'm not sure that he foreknew and called and predestined us, but he definitely did them. Right? That's kind of the gist here. And they're going to recognize that in just a little bit. Watch this.
And I was going to say as well, and that's brilliant, Derek, as well, because that's where I got from it. I was going to say, could you as well, Mr. Flowers, verse 29, because this was something that I picked up as well that you mentioned. It was the last part that done it for me, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brethren.
Yes.
So I don't know if you remember how you exegeted that part in verse 29.
Well, it's not a cut and dry thing like it proves.
Okay. So I just realized I've been going for an hour. So I'm going to do a part 2. I'm going to end it right here and come back to it. Hopefully one of these days. I do have another video I'm dropping where I'm interviewing somebody that you guys need to hear about. This is a very impactful story. And just thinking about it, man, I'm tearing up. You guys got to listen to this interview I'll be doing next week. And I think it's going to be a blessing to your lives. So, tune in. Before I go, any last words and last comments on this video? I'm not done with it, but, an hour is very long. Got other things to do, and also just there's still a little bit ways to go. So I don't want to do it all right now. But if anything else, anyone else wants anything, also any prayer requests as well. Like if you're in the live, if you're in the chat right now, you have a prayer request, please let me know. I would love to pray for you, pray for the request. Also let you know about, hopefully I'll be available to listen live. Yeah, I hope so too. I hope you find this a blessing, brother. I don't mean to ramble too much. This is live, so again, you know, I don't have all my thoughts together, but I have some of them. Also wanted to let you know about a ministry my wife and I have started called A Biblical Home, and we're very excited. We got some. We'll be heading out of town in September for a conference that we got accepted into, to be able to represent Christ in this conference and what we're trying to do, what the Lord has placed in our hearts. So A Biblical Home, you can go to abiblicalhome.org and check out our mission, what we do, what we sell, what our goals are, and things like that. Obviously, the name kind of gives it away. It's very family based and oriented. You know, we really are, my wife and I are very passionate about the home, about children and marriage, you know, being covenant dads and being faithful moms. And so we're very passionate about those things. So if you can, check it out, abiblicalhome.org. And if you see something you like, you know, make a purchase. We would appreciate it. Again, servant of Christ, thank you so much for being here, and everyone else for being here. Until next time, God bless.